Afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us, the Foreign Press Center, for its hybrid press briefing this afternoon. My name is Kazuo Kodama. I'm the president of the Foreign Press Center. I will be the moderator of today's press briefing. Now, it is our and my great pleasure to welcome today Mr. Terazawa Tatsuya, former Vice Minister for International Affairs, Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry, and now he is the chairman and CEO of the Institute of Energy Economics. Now, Economics of Japan. Now, he is a briefer today on Japan's energy strategy, achieving carbon neutrality and enhancing energy security. He is actually, I would say, a movers and one of the most influential movers and shakers of the Japanese policy on energy and beyond, energy source, economic security. Anyway, I would expect Terazawa-san will discuss what challenges Japan is facing in achieving carbon neutrality in 2050 and energy security at the same time, and what steps can be taken to solve them. Now, Mr. Terazawa will speak for 40 minutes using a slide followed by a 20 minutes Q&A session. Questions will be accepted mainly from foreign media, but if time allows, of course, embassy staff, embassy participation, you are also welcome to ask questions. You may post your questions in the Q&A section at any time after the briefing starts. Please note, handout for today's briefing was sent to your email addresses about an hour ago. It is available in English only. If you do not have the material, please write in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and we will send them to you. To those of you who are attending this press briefing in person, please make sure your cell phones are in silent mode. Well, Terazawa-san, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Kodama. Is my mic on? Do you hear me? Okay, let me have my slides on the screen. Okay, my name is Tatsuya Terazawa. Thank you very much for the kind introduction by Ambassador Kodama. It's my great honor to be able to make a presentation about Japan's energy strategy. I'll try to make my initial presentation within 40 minutes, but I don't know if I'm so successful, but I'll try to ensure that we will have sufficient time for Q&A. And actually, I have received some questions beforehand. I'll try to address some of them in my presentation, but I'm happy to, and I will be answering the remaining questions in my Q&A, but I'm happy to get further questions from you. So today's topic is Japan's energy strategy. I'll talk about carbon neutrality and also the energy security. We have to deal with those two pillars of policies. This graph shows you the GHG, the greenhouse gas emission goals for Japan. The dotted lines show the path for the future reduction of greenhouse gases. And as you know, former Prime Minister Suga made the announcement that Japan will be aiming for carbon neutrality by 2050. That is shown in the graph. And in 2030, Japan has already submitted an NDC, the National Defined Contribution, to reduce our GHG by 46% in 2030 compared with 2013. And if you can have a look at this graph, compared with our historical achievements, you can see how ambitious the reduction of GHG emission would be for Japan. While we have realized significant reduction in GHG after 2013, this is a year just following the Great East Japan earthquake, we have experienced steady improvement in the GHG reduction. But as you know, it will be more challenging to have a deeper cuts of GHG. So how can we achieve this GHG cut, especially towards 2030, which is our immediate goal? The Japanese government has decided on the cabinet decision to come up with its energy strategy towards 2030. And this shows the power mix, not the energy mix, a mix for the power generation. Fiscal year in Japan starts from April 1st and ends on March 31st. Compared with fiscal year 2019, when we had nuclear at 6% of our total power mix and renewable energies as 18% of our power mix. And this 18% includes hydropower, which at the time was about 9%. So the remaining 9% of renewable energies at the time was solar and wind power, with very limited geothermal in 2019. Our government strategy towards 2030 is to increase the percentage of renewable energies in our power mix towards 36 to 38%, and through restart of nuclear power plants to increase the percentage of nuclear to 20 to 22%. And that would result in a significant reduction in the proportion of fossil fuel from 76% of our power mix to 41% of the power mix. This is the government strategy, which was decided by the cabinet, but I would have to say this was criticized as being too ambitious by many experts at the time of this cabinet decision. But from some, we were criticized as being not too ambitious, especially for renewable energy. So this power mix was criticized from both sides. But nevertheless, this is the current government strategy that is in place. Let me look into some of the components to see the challenges we face in realizing this power mix. Certainly, we'll be pushing for renewable energies, and wind power is certainly one of the most likely option. This global map shows the availability of wind energy density. And if you have much reddish color, it shows that you have stronger wind flow. And if it becomes blue, it shows weak wind flow. As you can see from the global map, the general idea is that in the northern hemisphere, the larger the latitude becomes, the stronger the wind flow becomes. So you can see strong wind flows in UK, Denmark, Norway, and other countries, and including the northeastern part of the North America, in the eastern parts of Canada. And if you look towards the southern hemisphere, the map doesn't have the full picture of Latin America, but areas like Patagonia, towards the south of South America, you can expect to have a strong wind flow. Japan's latitude is not that high compared with most Western European countries. So as you can see from this global map of wind density, Japan is not necessarily endowed with very favorable wind power. And that's the challenge number one. And Japan faces the occasional attack by typhoons. And at the time of typhoons, you have to stop the wind power generation. And the wind towers should be built strong enough to withstand the typhoon, which makes the cost more expensive. So wind power faces a challenge, which is not necessarily faced by, especially the West European countries, which are endowed with better, much better wind power endowment. People might ask the question, well, Japan is surrounded by seas, so why not have offshore wind power generation, like in the North Sea, offshore of UK? But the current types of wind power generation are bottom fixed type wind power generation, and this would require shallow seafloor. UK has a vast space, sea zone, with very shallow seafloor, which will be ideal for offshore wind power generation. But Japan's, although surrounded by waters, the waters tend to go deep right away. So in terms of bottom fixed type of wind power generation, the available area compared with the UK is just 1/7 of what is the potential that you can see in UK. And on the other hand, the electricity demand in Japan is 3 times as great as in UK. So the relative contribution of wind power generation compared with UK in Japan is very different. And to overcome this difficulty, in the long term, we have to develop floating type offshore wind power generation, but it is still very challenging at this point. Then the next question is, what about solar? And while there is some stereotype that Japan is not pushing for renewable energies, the reality is that especially after the Fukushima nuclear accident, the Japanese government introduced a very generous feed-in tariff system, which pays for fixed amount of money for the generation of renewable energies. And that led to a massive deployment of solar panels in Japan. And Japan is a relatively small island country. And for those who are not knowledgeable about the geology of Japan, 70% of our small island consists of mountains. So flat land tend to be more ideal for solar power generation. And if we look at the solar capacity installment per flat land area, Japan is by far the largest among the major countries. Twice the amount of installment in UK, 7 times more than in UK, and 20 times more than in France, and nearly 20 times more than in China. And that shows that Japan has been installing solar panels in the limited flat land. But this will be a challenge for the future for further expansion of solar panels in Japan, because the additional installment of solar panels in Japan would have to compete with other land uses. The most visible areas in which solar panels were deployed after the Fukushima nuclear accident was the golf courses with not too many players. Those golf courses were turned into mega solar plants at the time. But now the remaining golf courses do have players remaining. So that shows that we have been successful in deploying solar panels, especially after the Fukushima nuclear accident, with a very generous feed-in tariff system. Further expansion will be more challenging. So what can we do? One of the challenge is that it will be more difficult to find the spaces available nearby Tokyo or Osaka. If we look to Hokkaido or Kyushu, those areas tend to be less populated. So there will be more potential for wind power generation and solar power generation in Hokkaido or Kyushu. But the challenge is that the transmission line has been very weak historically. And the reason is that historically we had 9 different regionally monopolized power companies. So the connections between the power companies was very weak. And to make the matters worse, the hertz, the frequency in Eastern Japan and Western Japan is different. For a small island country, this is stupid. But when we opened up our civilization, our country to the world after the major restoration, some companies got the technology from the US and other countries got the technology from Europe. And that was the reason why historically there are 2 frequencies in Japan, which makes the transportation of power more difficult. But in order to utilize the relatively more abundant land in Hokkaido or Kyushu, we have to construct long distance transmission lines. So actually the government came up with these master plans to construct long distance transmission lines. And we expect that the very powerful long distance power lines, transmission lines will be constructed, especially between Hokkaido and Tokyo, to further develop renewable energies in Japan. Another approach is to have innovation. As you know, solar panels are heavy and not flexible. So you can install solar panels on land or on rooftops, but beyond them, it will be more challenging. That's where innovation can take place. This next generation solar PV called perovskite solar cell is flexible, light, and it is printable. So with the deployment of this next generation solar PVs, we might be able to install solar cells to areas that would have been more difficult with the very heavy, rigid solar panels. There was a question among the reporters that what will be the potential for rooftop solar panels in Japan? Yes, we'll be pushing for rooftop solar panels. But looking at the rooftops in Japan, you will notice the roofs are not that large. And some of the roofs are under the shadows of the other buildings. And even looking at the old buildings constructed in Tokyo, there's not too much space available on the rooftops. There are other uses for the rooftop. So just focusing on rooftops would have limited potential for solar panels deployment. So this is where this film-based perovskite PV could expand the potential areas for solar panels installment. So we are working to expand both solar power deployment through this kind of flexible film-based PVs, and also by constructing long distance transmission lines, and also in the future to develop floating type offshore wind power generation, which can be installed in deeper seas. So these are what we are doing with the renewable energies. The next question is about nuclear, and this map shows the status of the nuclear power plants in Japan. After Fukushima, 24 nuclear plants units were decommissioned. This includes some of them which had been decommissioned even before Fukushima. So this is a total of units being decommissioned, 24. And so we have 36 remaining nuclear power units in Japan, including 3 under construction. Among those 36, 10 have already restarted, and 7 passed the basic review, and under review by NRA, 10 units, and 9 units have not been applied for review yet. Prime Minister Kishida mentioned in the speech last year that he will be pushing for restart of nuclear power plants in Japan, and he talked about 17 units. This 17 units represents this sum of the 10 being restarted and 7 which have passed review. So that's what he has in the relatively short term, but we are looking for further restart of nuclear power plants, including the additional 10 which are now under review by NRA. But just going through NRA will not be sufficient to restart the nuclear power plants. We have to get the consent from the local community. So this is a challenge. We'll be trying. But this shows that, yes, Japan has already succeeded in restarting significant numbers, 10 nuclear units, but we are facing difficulties as well. The next chart shows the capacity of nuclear power in Japan over the time. After the Fukushima nuclear accident, the government put into place a rule that the operating life of nuclear power plants will be 40 years in principle, with a one-time only extension of 20 years possible. So with the 40-year operating life, you can see the blue graph, which shows the nuclear capacity would go down significantly after 2030. This will be a problem for us to reduce CO2 emission, because nuclear is a CO2-free power generation. So without being able to use nuclear, it will lead to more CO2 emission. So one option is to extend the operation by 20 years. That will take us to the green graph, which shows a longer availability of nuclear. But as you can see, after the early part of 2040s, the nuclear capacity would go down significantly. And so this is the reason why Prime Minister Kishida pushed and succeeded in changing the law in Japan to enable the extension of the operation of nuclear power plants beyond 60 years. So if we can extend that beyond 60 years, you would have the third graph to the right, which would enable a longer duration of nuclear power plants in Japan. But it cannot go forever. The extension allowed by our diet only allows for the extension by the years in which the nuclear power plants were closed. After Fukushima nuclear accident, for nearly 12 years, many nuclear power plants were stopped, so that 12 years could be added. So 60 plus 12 will be 72 years. That will be the expected length of the operation of nuclear reactors. But after 7 years, the nuclear capacity will certainly start to go down again. And that's the reason why Prime Minister Kishida mentioned in its third part of nuclear policy that he would consider replacement of the existing nuclear power plants. Replacement certainly requires the construction of new nuclear reactors. Let me turn to other subjects which would lead to hydrogen. As you can see from the left side graph, the strategy to reduce CO2 emission is to raise the electricity ratio. The reason is that electricity is relatively easier to reduce CO2 emission, as you can see from the right side of the graph. By using renewable energies and nuclear, power, electricity can have lower carbon dioxide emission to provide energy. So that's the reason why many countries are pushing for higher electricity ratio. But unfortunately, you cannot have 100% electricity ratio. The left side graph shows our outlook for the future globally, for the advanced economies. We expect in 2050, the electricity ratio to be rising from 22% of today to 37%. Some institutes may come with a higher expectation of electricity ratio, like 50%. But which means the other 50% will not be coming from electricity. Other means of energy will be supplying the final energy demand. But the bad news is that if you look at the right side graph, it is relatively easy to decarbonize the power sector, but it will be more challenging to decarbonize the non-power sector. What do I mean by non-power sector? These are basically the industrial and transportation sector, like the steel, chemical, aviation, maritime transportation, land transportation. The easiest example is aviation. Do you want to get on an airplane just flying with just batteries? You don't want to have batteries run out while you are in top of the sky. So batteries or electrification of aviation would be extremely difficult. So this is just one example, but these are the so-called hard to abate sectors. So steel, aviation, maritime transportation, to decarbonize these sectors, you cannot rely on electricity. And that's where hydrogen can play an important role to decarbonize these hard to abate sectors. For example, for aviation, you can produce SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, from hydrogen. And this would enable long distance flying. So hydrogen will be a key in decarbonizing half of the energy demand. But hydrogen does have a problem. It's hard to transport. If you can have pipelines, you can transport hydrogen. So European countries have the advantage in this regard, but Japan does not have pipelines connecting Japan with other countries. So we have to have seaborne transportation of hydrogen, which will be very extremely difficult, because to transport hydrogen gas, you would need a huge ship to carry gas-based hydrogen. So one way is to liquefy hydrogen, like LNG, liquefied natural gas. But the challenge is that to have hydrogen liquefied, you have to cool it down to minus 253 degrees Celsius. The absolute temperature is minus 273 degrees Celsius, as we might have learned in science when we were in the middle school. This minus 253 degrees Celsius goes very close to the absolute low level of zero. So it's possible, but it's very expensive. So what are the other means? MCH, this is to combine hydrogen with a substance called toluene. And this could enable transportation as a liquid without cooling. Ammonia you can liquefy ammonia at -33 degrees Celsius. So we have to find ways to transport hydrogen efficiently. And we have conducted a study to compare the cost of transporting hydrogen. As of 2030, to transport hydrogen from Saudi Arabia to Japan, liquefied hydrogen turns out to be the most expensive. MCH, in combining with toluene, comes next. But among the options, it appears ammonia is the cheapest in transporting hydrogen to Japan from Saudi Arabia as of 2030. And this is the reason why you hear more about ammonia in Japan. The next question is, why do we have two ammonia in this graph? The ammonia from the second left is reconverted, carrying hydrogen as ammonia, but once ammonia is reaching Japan, you crack ammonia back to hydrogen. So it requires additional cost of recracking. Ammonia to the left side is to use ammonia as is as fuel. So by skipping the process of recracking, ammonia with direct use as fuel is the cheapest. So for Japan, which has been the pioneer in highlighting hydrogen ammonia, this direct use is probably the first usage of hydrogen-related products. And one of the areas which Japan has been criticized heavily internationally, including international press, is about the coal-fired power plants. But we have to look at what we are facing in reality. This graph shows the percentage, the shares of very young coal-fired power plants in Asia, less than 10 years old. And if you look at India or Southeast Asia, about 60% of the coal-fired power plants fleet in Asia are less than 10 years old. And most coal-fired power plants in Europe or the US are very old. So it is fairly easy for European countries or American countries, the North American countries, to retire coal-fired power plants. Japan is in the between. And you can see that 10% of the coal-fired power plants in Japan are less than 10 years old, but this is as of 2018. The reality is that Japan, after the Fukushima nuclear accident, when Japan had to shut down all the nuclear power plants, the power companies have to scramble to build alternative power plants. And they were either gas-fired power plants or coal, and most likely coal-fired power plants. So as of 2018, this percentage was 10%, but the most recent figure is 15%. The new coal-fired power plants came online in the past few years because many of them started construction after the Fukushima nuclear accident. So our challenge, in similar with our Asian friends, is that when you have a very young fleet of coal-fired power plants, it will be more difficult to retire them early. So that's the fundamental difference between the situation in Europe or North America compared with the situation in Asia. And this is the reason, and at the same time, there's so much power demand for power in Asia. These power plants will be necessary, not just commercially, but also to supply sufficient power for growth. And for Japan, I hope I have time to discuss this, but on March 22nd of last year, for those who were in Japan, Japan faced the possibility of blackout due to a shortage of power. I can give you many reasons, but this shows the necessity in Japan to ensure sufficient supply of power. So coupled with the young fleet of coal-fired power plants and the necessity to have power supply, we have to consider means to ensure the operation of these coal-fired power plants, but at the same time reducing CO2 emission. That's the reason why Japan came up with the idea of co-firing a coal-fired power plant with low-carbon ammonia. So this is the background, which is being criticized, but this is the background for why we are talking about this. The Japanese government came up with the GX roadmap. By the way, GX is green transformation. We thought this was an English vocabulary, but we found out this is Japanese English. But so hopefully you can report that GX does mean green transformation. IRA is so known, well known in the US, in the world. GX is not known, but probably you can touch upon GX as our strategy for the transformation. And this has a 10-year plan for the green transformation, expecting 150 trillion investment and including the 20 trillion government spending. It has a schedule to have carbon pricing in Japan and pushing for renewable energy and nuclear power in the way I described, and also for hydrogen and ammonia. In addition to the transportation challenge, it is very expensive. So no one is going to use hydrogen and ammonia because they're so expensive. So we are trying to introduce a framework to offset the cost disadvantage. These are part of the GX roadmap. I think I have to accelerate. Talking about energy security, this shows the percentage of energy self-sufficiency. Japan is the lowest among any major countries. And this is the background which leads to the Japanese obsession with energy security. The left-hand graph shows our dependence on Middle East crude oil. At the time, just prior to the first oil shock in 1973, the percentage was 77%. So Japan tried very hard to lower our dependence on Middle East, and the lowest level was achieved in 1987, reaching 68%. But unfortunately, with complacency and the other countries like Mexico turning from an exporter to importer of crude oil, the percentage started to go up. And at the time, just after the Ukraine invasion by Russia, the percentage reached 96%. We depend 96% of our crude oil from Middle East. But this is not just a Japanese problem. Globally speaking, Middle East now provides 40% of the global crude oil export, but this percentage will go up. Our expectation is it will go up to 43%. But with all the pressure against investment by Western companies in fossil fuel, we expect this percentage of Middle East to go even higher. So in terms of energy security, we have to think about our vulnerability that not just Japan, but the world continues to depend probably more on Middle East crude oil. So this is something that we have to really be knowledgeable about, is that while the absolute level of oil consumption may go down, the percentage of our dependence on Middle East will go up. So that poses us with the energy security challenge. So for Japan, as we have done in the past, we have to diversify of our energy, not just crude oil, but other energy. And this has been natural gas and LNG. And you can see from the graph that the spot LNG and TTF stands for European gas price. These are the spot markets. And the green shows the Japan LNG average. This shows the price. Compared with Europe, Japan's increase in the LNG import in terms of price was relatively modest. We were helped by long-term contracts, which was basically indexed to crude oil price. The crude oil price went up, but not as bad as the spot market. So this is the reason why the European countries face a much more serious challenge than us, because they had to depend and they had to procure their LNG from the spot market. This shows a graph of our long-term contracts that we have in place for LNG. As you can see, Australia has been our greatest and our largest supplier of LNG. As of 2022, probably more than 40% of our LNG is coming from Australia on a long-term basis. But long-term contracts do expire. So we have to start thinking about what will be the offsetting long-term contracts to ensure that we have a stable supply of LNG. We were protected by long-term contracts to overcome the current crisis. But as many of them would expire, we have to seek new long-term contracts with countries. And this is where I have already received questions about the potential for Australia and Alaska. I'm happy to answer those questions, but we are seriously looking into options for long-term contracts. And probably you will not be surprised that we have to take Russia out of the option. So we have to find options. And probably the most likely candidate would have been Australia. But with the recent changes in the policy by the Australian government, it poses a very serious question as to the future role of Australia as a trusted supplier of LNG. So that makes us very much concerned, and that forces us into look for other alternative options for LNG supply in the future, and that would include Alaska. I'll skip this chart. The G7 summit was concluded in Hiroshima, and the international press did not necessarily focus on climate, energy, environment, but just to share with you some of the achievements of the G7 summit. It came up with a message that there's a common goal, but there should be various pathways, not a single pathway. I think this was a very important message from Japan and for the Asian countries. And energy security was highlighted as well. And resilience of supply chains for critical minerals, which will be increasingly more important as we make the energy transition, was highlighted in this G7 summit communique. And while this was heatedly debated, but we succeeded in recognizing the role of investment in the gas sector. Having said so, mentioning of the global south, to be very honest, was very weak. If you look at the 40-page communique coming out from the leaders, there are so many mentioning made about the sense of crisis about the global climate issue, but I would struggle to find any word mentioning energy access or energy affordability. And the global south would have a much longer transition period than the West. And it is quite clear that they would have a much greater independence on fossil fuel compared with the West. They would require stability in the price throughout their transition process for the conventional energy. And I believe that would require stable investment. But very little is being reflected in the G7 summit. G7 summit naturally is among the 7 advanced economies. But I believe that we have to think about globally. And it's a pity that has been very little mentioning about the global south, especially about energy access and affordability. And that's something that I think we have to work on. And hopefully at the G20 summit, led by India, this is an aspect that will be covered more. Finally, we have always considered in Japan's energy policy to have S+3E. S stands for safety, E stands for environment, economic efficiency, and energy security. In a year after Prime Minister Suga made the announcement of carbon neutrality, among this S+3, we had exclusively focused on a single E, which was the environment. But with this energy crisis and invasion of Ukraine, now we have to think about S+3 as a whole. So our energy policy challenge is how can we realize this S+3 in the most optimal manner? And these are the challenges that we are facing today. I could not cover all the questions that I received in advance. I'm happy to address those questions. I shall stop my initial presentation here.
Mr. Terazawa, thank you very much indeed. Everything is to the point, very comprehensive. And I think you covered all the, important, discussion, issues regarding this major problem. Now, floor is open to the Q&A session. I have in this room a journalist. So first, I will give a priority to her to ask a question. Could you identify yourself and then ask your question, please? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sylvan LeBrun, and I report for the Wall Street Journal in Tokyo. Thank you so much for covering this topic in your presentation as well. But my question is, given the growing concern around Tokyo's electricity supply, particularly as summers get hotter due to global warming, what changes in terms of energy policy are necessary in order to sustainably and reliably power the city? And also how feasible of a solution is the rooftop solar plan announced by the Tokyo government?
Well, let me briefly explain what happened on March 22nd. So it's not just the summer peak. We're concerned about the winter peak as well. On March 22nd of last year, we had the unfortunate combination of several factors. One was that for March, late March, it was extremely cold, leading to heat demand. And we had modest minor earthquakes a few weeks before March 22nd, which disrupted the operation of some of the power plants in the Tokyo region. And the third is that due to maybe 1 or 2 decades of reforming our power market to introduce more competition, the power companies had been retiring many of the existing older thermal power plants. So we had a very limited buffer available at the time, because facing competition, they could not afford to keep those non-working older power plants, so they were gone. So the buffer was very limited. And finally, to make the matter worse, was that day was very cloudy, and we lost the power generation from the solar panels. And for the Tokyo region, the amount of loss amounted to 13 gigawatts. This would amount to 13 units of nuclear reactors. So this is the challenge, a combination of challenge we're facing. But as we introduce more renewable energies, we have to deal with this intermittency. So there has to be power to offset the 13 gigawatt loss on a cloudy day. And we assume that 13 to be greater and greater and greater as we introduce more renewable energies. We would need to have a dispatchable power, which would not be affected by the clouds or the wind flows. But we don't have the necessary investment structure in place because of our years of reforming our market. So now the Japanese government is now introducing a long-term decarbonized power auction system, which would guarantee a return for the investment in the low carbon dispatchable power for 20 years. This would provide the incentives to ensure that we have a stable supply of power. This may be very different from what we had in the market reform, which depended on a day-by-day auction market to have the supply of power, which was good for the short term, but did not enable long-term investment. So now we are having a change in our power policy, or the market structure, to enable a long-term supply of power available. Respond to your question about rooftop. Yes, we have to have rooftops solar panels, but as I touched upon, we cannot have sufficient amount of power generation just by having solar panels on limited rooftops. So that's the reason why one way to do it is that we have to have flexible type solar cells to utilize other areas as possible. And we cannot just depend upon solar panels or solar cells. We have to look into wind power. But as I said, unfortunately, the wind power generation is not very easy, considering the deepness of our seas. So we have to develop floating type of wind power generation to have a long-term prospect of renewable energy, together with trying to utilize the potential in Hokkaido or Kyushu through long-distance transmission lines.
Thank you. Listen, I have recognized 4 questions are submitted through the Q&A screen. So please be patient. I will pick up all those questions. But before that, I have a few more questions submitted to us prior to today's press briefing. And one is, of course, from Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung's Mr. Tim Cunning's question. I just read it out. What role can hydrogen play in Japan's energy strategy? What investments are needed in that technology now?
Can I take off my jacket?
Oh, please.
It's like global warming, but I'm getting warmer.
Sorry.
Sorry. I think Tim, I think I touched upon the role of hydrogen for Japan. the role of hydrogen will be extremely important to decarbonize our hard to abate sectors, such as the industrial sector and transportation sector. And number two, it will be important to reduce the carbon emission from the existing coal-fired power plants or even gas-fired power plants. We can have coal-firing for gas-fired power plants as well. Co-firing natural gas or LNG with ammonia or hydrogen, we can reduce CO2 emission from the existing thermal power generation. And third, this is something that I have not touched upon, that we have a constraint in the potential for renewable energy in Japan, but you cannot import renewable energies into Japan unless you have transmission lines. And probably the realistic way is to produce hydrogen somewhere else outside of Japan using renewable energies, and then like Chile, and producing hydrogen in those countries using renewable energies, turning them into hydrogen and sending hydrogen to Japan somehow. And that is an indirect way to import renewable energies. So these are the three roles I see for hydrogen. What are the necessary investments? Number one, it is the transportation. We have to find the efficient ways to transport hydrogen, and we are having competing methods, liquefied hydrogen or MCH or ammonia. All of these would require investing in the transportation. And also for the usage, you cannot just transform the current usage of thermal power into hydrogen right away. You would require, you're burning something different, so you need to have investment in that regard. And also, we would have to have investment in the upstream. Just for hypothetically, if we are to produce hydrogen in Chile using renewable energies, we would have to have an electrolyzer in Chile. And then we have to have some facilities to turn hydrogen into more in a form that could be transported to Japan. So we will have to have investment in many steps of the supply chain. And this would have to be aligned. If we miss one piece, then there's no supply of hydrogen. So this will require a coordination of investment among various steps. And this will require a global cooperation. And for your reference, Japan pioneered the supply chain for LNG. The first cargo of LNG came from Alaska to Japan in 1969. And it took us 50 years to get to where we are with the LNG market. And without this global energy market, Europe did not have a choice following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But as we led the development of the LNG supply chain, we provided an option for our European friends. But once again, it took us 50 years to get to where we are. For the supply chain for hydrogen and ammonia, we have to do it in a much shorter time. And this will require much more concerted efforts among various players from the supplier side, user side, and with other countries.
Thank you. Another question actually from the Australian Financial Review. I think you touched already on this question, but anyway, let me read it out. Are you concerned about Australia phasing out new energy projects and energy security?
Well, as I touched upon, currently, Australia is our largest supplier of LNG, supplying more than 40%. And since 1989, when the first cargo of LNG came from Australia, we have been one of the best partners in the supply and usage of LNG. And Australia has been our most trusted supplier of LNG. Unfortunately, the recent policy changes in Australia put serious questions to the future role of Australia as a reliable supplier of LNG. While we understand the necessity to accelerate measures to reduce CO2, I think it would be necessary to protect the business interests of investors who have put their money to support the LNG supply. I think it was in May 2019, I accompanied the late Prime Minister Abe to Darwin in Australia to celebrate the start of a major LNG project called Ichthys, a major one. So Australia and Japan work together at the highest level to develop and supply LNG. But now, with a change in policies, new constraints or burdens are put in place. It's like changing the rule of the games after the game has started. And the game was started at the highest level. And I think, while we understand the need to deal with the environment issue, I think this long-term trust and win-win relationship that we have developed over years would have to be more respected. And this is not just for the existing projects like ICFIS, but there are also projects with which the FID, the decision to investment, has already been made. But suddenly, with the new policy, the called safety mechanism reform, suddenly the achievement, realization of carbon neutrality from day one is suddenly required. But if the expected plan to start shipping those LNG from the ongoing projects, not completed, but already under construction, and suddenly you are told that maybe by 2025, when you start shipping your LNG, you have to realize carbon neutrality. That would be extremely difficult for any operator to satisfy. And also, there might be an argument. Yes, you can use carbon credits. There's an Australian carbon credit unions called ACCUs, or talk about, you can have CCS, carbon storage. But these are expensive. So who pays for this? In the US, there's IRA. The US government is very helpful in supporting CCS, carbon storage in the US. But to the best of knowledge, there's nothing similar in Australia, and just a requirement that you have to realize carbon neutrality on day one for projects already underway. So this will be very difficult for many operators and not very realistic. So I think there has to be more consideration how to balance the legitimate requirements to reduce CO2 emission while being respectful of the business interests of the operators and seeing the reality. And if there are other policies needed, there has to be serious efforts to provide those options. And that's for the Australian question.
Thank you. And now, next question concerns the nuclear power station. And the question is posed by South China Morning Post, Mr. Anthony Rowley. I just read it out for you. I am Terazawa-san. How much of the projected increase in nuclear power comes from existing but mothballed nuclear stations, and how much from planned new nuclear plants, including SMRs? You explained in your slide 10, I think. Yes.
Well, whatever numbers we have today is all about restarting the existing nuclear power plant. As I said, 10 units have already been restarted. We have 26 remaining nuclear reactors which are not in operation. So just maximally, we can potentially restart 36 nuclear power plants, including 3 under construction. Beyond that, we don't have specific figures put into place. So the vast majority of the nuclear power for 2030 or in the short term, midterm, would have to come from existing nuclear power plants. There is a substantial lead time to construct and operate new nuclear power plants, even if they are replacing. But if we look at 2050 and beyond, that's nearly 30 years from today. And that would enable to have sufficient time frame to accommodate the replacing of nuclear power plants. And that's where would be a potential, but we don't have any specific figures of units we expect to be replaced. So to answer your question, the vast foreseeable amount will come from the restart of these nuclear power plants and extending many of them beyond 60 years. But for the replacement, we only have the direction without any specific figures.
Thank you. Next question concerns kind of the electricity transmission grid system to be revamped in the sense the questioner is Le Figaro's Regis Arno, who asks, what do you think of South Korea undersea power cable, for example, between Busan and Imari, Japan, to share power? It seems that Japanese power companies do not study the idea. Do you think it is a good idea?
Well, I cannot represent the Japanese government. I used to work for the Japanese government, but today I do not represent the Japanese government. To have a transmission lines connecting two countries, you have to have the highest level of trust, which will be there for decades to come. You cannot have 4 years or 5 years of good relationship and power supply, and the next 5 years you have difficulty. That is not possible with the energy supply. So hopefully, the two leaders of Japan and South Korea are now engaging in improving our relationship dramatically. And hopefully, if we can be sure that this relationship can be long-lasting, even with the changes in the leadership after elections, this is when we can seriously think about having that transmission lines connecting South Korea with Japan. But before that, we have to do much more to establish a long-lasting trust relationship between the two countries, which I hope that will be the case.
Thank you. And our next question is put by New York Times, Motoko Rich-san. You have the floor. Can you speak up, please?
Yes, Terazawa-san, thank you so much for coming and explaining so clearly all of the reasons for Japan's challenges. I had a couple of questions. One is, you talked about the difficulty of retiring young coal plants. Is that difficult just because you have invested, this is a stranded asset problem that you don't have enough time to depreciate the asset? Why is it difficult to retire a young plant? And my other question is, in your very first slide, you showed a proposed 2030 energy plan for power breakdown. Hydrogen ammonia only represented 1%. But you spent a lot of time in your presentation talking about hydrogen ammonia, which makes me wonder if it's actually a bigger emphasis for Japan. And you've also talked about the challenges for floating wind power, but haven't shown much optimism or kind of entrepreneurial spirit in terms of what Japan might do to make that more of a reality. I know that's several questions, but I'm hoping that you can get to some of it.
Well, I didn't take notes, so hopefully I can cover all the questions.
I'll remember them, yes.
But about the first question, the reason why we cannot retire the young coal-fired power plants early are for two reasons. One, as you mentioned, you have a huge amount of book value staying with those coal-fired power plants. If you retire them, you have to have a huge write-off, which would certainly hit the bottom lines of power companies, which would result in a higher price for electricity for our consumers. That's number one. And number two, the reason why I stressed about March 22nd of last year is in line with this attempt to answer your question. We have a potential shortage of power supply in Japan, and one other element I failed to mention was we still have many nuclear power plants which are still stalled. So that's the reason why we need to have sufficient power supply, and we cannot afford to retire the coal-fired power plants for those reasons. So it's number one, commercial business, but it's not just business. It affects the consumers and the industry's price tag for electricity, but also for the absolute insufficiency in the supply of power. And the second question was
Motoko-san, could you repeat your second question?
Yeah, sorry, your
Yeah.
first slide suggests that hydrogen and ammonia is a very
Oh, yeah,
small
okay.
part
Oh,
of the
yeah.
2030 plan, but you spend so much time talking about it your plans for innovating on hydrogen transport, which made me think that you actually have bigger plans for hydrogen and ammonia in the power generation sector.
Well, this strategy was decided in I think it was in late 2021. So a year and a half has passed since the decision of this power mix. So we might have a greater figure attached for this 2030 for hydrogen ammonia, but hydrogen ammonia requires time to realize its full potential. So and they're extremely expensive at this point. So our expectation is that we attach great importance for the potential of hydrogen hydrogen-ammonia, but we have to recognize the reality that it would take some more time to really lower the cost of hydrogen and ammonia. And the third point you mentioned about was the our ambition or entrepreneurial spirit for floating type wind power generation. This is certainly an area in which we are pushing for. Unfortunately, we had a pilot project offshore of Fukushima after the Fukushima nuclear accident, but that pilot project failed miserably, and that has been a setback in the floating type wind power generation. But recognizing the need to develop and deploy renewable energy in Japan, probably the logical option would to seek offshore floating type wind power generation. So now we are having renewed interest in developing floating type wind power generation. And as you might have heard about the GI fund, the Green Innovation Fund, among those projects that have been supported by the government to engage in R&D, there are at least 3 projects, consortiums dealing with floating type wind power generation. So we are pushing for wind power generation, but the wind power generation for offshore floating type would be more challenging than other countries. For example, having floating type wind power generation in the Mediterranean Sea, where the current is very weak, and the sea is not that deep. For Japan, the current is very strong, and also the sea are very deep. Even if you have floating type, you need to ensure that the floating type wind power generation will not go to Alaska. So you have to find a mechanism to keep it stable. So that's more challenging when you have a deeper sea with a stronger current and occasional typhoon. But we are trying to develop this new technology, and that's the reason why at least 3 projects are now being sponsored by the GI fund.
Okay. I have actually 2 more questions.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to answer those questions. So for those of you who have time constraint, please, you can leave me online. I cannot see you, so you can feel free to cut off the line. But I will be happy to cover other questions.
Because
Sure.
well, come back to I think I don't want to do justice to also Ms. Leblon Silvan. You have a question about Alaskan oil, so I just read out for you. Just the point: to what extent is Alaskan liquefied natural gas an option for Japan in terms of shifting the supply chains away from Russia?
Well, certainly, as I said, we have to look for our long-term contracts for LNG for the future, as we have expiring long-term contracts, and we have to take Russia out from the calculation. And with Australia, for the reasons I said, it is a great pity that we do have serious question marks about the future, especially for the new LNG projects relating to Australia. So we have to look for alternative options at the same time. And in that regard, Alaska LNG has a potential because it's closer to us. Compared with other LNG coming from the US, it's coming from the Gulf of Texas, it would have to go through the Panama Canal, and Panama Canal has many difficulties like congestions and troubles and so on. So the capability, the possibility of transporting LNG directly from Alaska to Japan, short distance, without using the Panama Canal is very attractive. And as I said, the first LNG cargo actually came from Alaska. So there's a historical background. Having said so, those are the pluses. And also, I've been told that Alaska LNG would not have to consider about the domestic usage in the US. The problem with the US is that when there's a shortage of gas or energy within the US, America comes first. And there will be restrictions against the export of US produced energy. But Alaska is an exception because there's no way really to send the Alaska LNG to the other 48 states in the continental North America. So those are the beauties of Alaskan LNG. Having said so, there are challenges as well because you have to construct new pipelines from the north of Alaska to the southern part of Alaska. That will be more expensive. And number two, it will require a longer payback period. And considering the carbon neutrality goal of 2050, you have to make sure that you can make the repayment by that time frame. And that's the second challenge. And the third one is that people are so unsure about the future of LNG. As of now, they see the huge demand. But what would happen 10 years or 15 years from now? It remains as question mark. So there has to be a flexibility in how you can utilize the LNG coming out from Alaska. So those cost, time frame, and the flexibility would be the challenges which would be put against all the beauties of the LNG coming from Alaska.
Thank you. Two questions actually from the embassy staff or embassy diplomats. One from Embassy of Colombia, Mr. Juan Gomez, who asks, how does Japan view Colombia's energy resources, particularly in terms of coal and its potential for blue hydrogen projects?
Well, Colombia has been one of our significant exporters of coal to Japan. I understand they are used for thermal power generation in Japan. And as I said, coal-fired power plants would continue to have a role, but in the long term, that we would have a reduced role for coal power plants in Japan because we have to reduce our CO2 emission. At the same time, we know, and we have actually tried producing hydrogen from coal. Actually, we have a pilot project in Australia producing hydrogen from brown coal. The beauty of producing hydrogen from brown coal is that it's cheaper and it would diversify the source of feedstock to produce hydrogen. So we continue to have interest in producing hydrogen from coal, but at the same time, producing hydrogen from coal would emit more CO2 in the process. So you have to deal with the CO2 to really have low carbon hydrogen. And you would have to have a location for CCS nearby. That's where I think, I'm not quite sure if Colombia has access to CCS location nearby. Having secured those CCS locations to absorb that CO2, the overall cost has to be competitive with other options. So certainly we are open to various options to secure hydrogen or ammonia because we need them. So we need them in volume. We need them in less expensive manner. So we are open to many possibilities in that regard.
Thank you very much. This would be the final question actually from an official from Chile, Invest Chile, Mr. Vincent Pinto, who asks, how does geopolitical risk condition Japan's energy security supply strategy? This is a very generic question, but anyway.
Well, it's a broad question. I would probably need 1 hour more to address this question, but as I mentioned in my presentation, we are obsessed with energy security because of our very, very low level of self-sufficiency in energy. And we have always been considering the risk of geopolitical developments. As I described, it is probably more than likely that for crude oil, our dependence on Middle East would go up because no one else is investing in crude oil, and Middle East countries are investing in crude oil, so naturally their percentage will go up. So what we have to do with crude oil is to have sufficient reserves to deal with that risk, but also we have to diversify our energy supply from crude oil to other options. So that's the reason why we continue to attach great importance to LNG as a transition fuel for an extended period of time. And also that's another reason why we attach great importance to nuclear. In addition to being a low carbon power generating source for nuclear, for us, it has the best, one of the best energy security benefits of having nuclear. And also, we are looking into renewable energies. If we can have renewable energies to be produced domestically, it would reduce our vulnerabilities in terms of energy security. But just as the G7 communique mentioned, we have to be reminded of where we could get the access for wind turbines or solar panels. We cannot depend upon a single supplier for wind power generators or solar panels. And we have to make sure the materials, the critical materials or minerals to be used for many clean energy technologies will not be supplied by a single dominant country. So we have to diversify our supply chain in that regard. So, and also that would lead to hydrogen and ammonia, where we can get those hydrogen and ammonia. We have to be, it will be better if we can have access to hydrogen and ammonia from places where there's not so much geopolitical risk. So that's one of the reasons. In addition to the low cost of hydrogen to be produced in Chile because of the low cost of renewable energies and abundance of renewable energy in Chile, the absence of geopolitical concerns in Chile makes the hydrogen ammonia to be imported from Chile as being attractive. But this is in competition, and Japan is seriously looking for options for hydrogen and ammonia, and also for LNG. So hopefully those countries will present us with better conditions, cost-wise, and also carbon emission-wise, and also geopolitical-wise, so that we can bet our future on those supplies. So we have great hope for Chile, and we have potentially our greatest expectation for Australia. But to ensure that Australia will continue to be a major player for energy supply, not just for conventional energies like LNG, but also for hydrogen and ammonia for the future, we want to see that we can trust Australia for the future, which is now being put with a question mark.
Thank you very much, Terazawa-san. Time has time has come to conclude today's press briefing. Again, Mr. Terazawa, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule. Thank you very much for your very much exhaustive, the very comprehensive, actually, the briefing on all the important issues pertaining to today's topic. The net zero by 2050 and so related issues. So I would like to also thank foreign media journalists, embassy participants, and others, and then as well as other audience who have participated in today's briefing. Thank you all. Maybe Terazawa-san, any final word from you, or anyway, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. The only thing is that I could not possibly cover all the aspects, and I probably was not able to answer all your questions. I'm available for any questions. Maybe not today, but through Ambassador Kodama, I'm always reachable, and I'm happy to see any one of you, in person or through online. So I'm happy to answer whatever question you have.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was my great pleasure.